is what I'm going to be using for my new workbench top. It is old cargo flooring that comes in 4-foot sections. I missed out on being able to get the 6-foot lengths, so I'm going to have to do a little bit more joining of these than I was hoping for, but they came in at about 15 bucks each. It's going to have some cleaning up to do.
Because this was cargo flooring, they had a little bit of a kind of tongue and groove, or at least a groove that they locked into each other. So I'm cutting that off, and then I also cut one of these long pieces into thirds because I'm going to attach that to widen those other 3 pieces. So again, there were 4 total. Now there are 3 slightly wider pieces. That brought them to about a little over a foot wide. And this right here is some white oak that was actually underneath that grizzly bandsaw in the background. This was a vase that the original owner had made. And so what I'm doing is I'm really just cutting those into pieces to make my own butcher block that eventually is going to be the solid gap stop in the middle. So because these main pieces are not 6 foot in length, I'm going to take one of these 4-foot sections, cut it in half, so 2-foot sections, and then I'm going to actually splice these on to the end of the other 2 4-foot long ones, so I will end up with 2 6-foot sections in the end, and again just a little bit over a foot wide. And this will be the majority, the main part of the workbench, and then you'll see here in a little bit how I'm going to join all this together. I'm marking out where I'm going to put some biscuits, and these are strictly for alignment purposes. This really isn't going to make this kind of end grain to end grain joint very strong, but again, it will help keep the tops flat and aligned. You'll see in a little bit, few later steps, how I'm going to actually, reinforce this bench top, so it's actually going to be pretty stout. But right now, I'm just going to be connecting these 4-foot pieces to the 2-foot pieces, again, to have that main workbench top to be able to be 6 foot in length in the end. This glue up right here was pretty janky. I obviously don't have any 6-foot long clamps, so doubling them up worked pretty good, but because the way I needed to clamp it up, I couldn't get even pressure on both sides. So here it's wanting to bow up. So what I ended up doing is actually clamping the workpiece to the table, which kind of kept it flat. It ended up in the end keeping it dead on, and then I could tighten the other clamps, keeping that pressure for the actual glue up. So while it was kind of a wonky deal to a little bit stressful trying to get those glued up, it worked out fine in the end. Here's another montage basically of trying to get all those 3 pieces now to their final width, and you saw in that last shot as I was getting it passed through the table saw, it left some pretty gnarly burn marks, and so I just put my flat sanding disc in and gave it a couple passes on both sides, and you'll see the results are really nice. It gives it a nice finish without any burn marks, and it is perfectly parallel on both sides. And so at this point, what I'm doing is I'm actually cutting some long strips of white oak that I had left over from a previous project. This is going to be one of the ways I reinforce these longer pieces, again, that were Frankenstein, end grain to end grain glued up. So I'm getting a clean edge on both sides, cut it to its actually, its final width now with a blade, and then in the next phase, again, you can see the burning. So I will run these through the sanding disc as well, get that nice and flat, and then you'll see how I'm going to add that white oak strip right here that I cut down. This is going to go on the outside. So again, that long 6 foot plus piece is going to be glued to that whole section, giving it some more strength, and then you'll see in a later step how I'm going to join the 2 major pieces together while adding that gap stop in the middle. I purposefully cut the white oak strips a little bit wide. I used the biscuits to align the tops, and so you see I have a bit of an overhang there, this is the bottom here now. It was easy to remove with a flush trim bit. I'm about to clamp these 3 pieces together, and before I do that, I'm actually adding these playing cards in just to give a little bit of space between the solid gap stop and the other 2 workbench pieces for this next step. What I'm milling down now are some pieces of white oak that are going to act as supports, much like a C-channel would in a tabletop. I'm going to route out some recesses for them to sit in, and they're going to serve a couple of purposes. One is to tie in the 2 main pieces of the workbench together so that they are constantly in the same kind of in space, the same distance apart always, which is also the same distance with the gap in between them for the gap stop. But these supports will give the gap stop something to sit on and be supported by. It'll make a little bit more sense as I start to route out this recess here in this next step. I'm marking, obviously, those support pieces out, and then I'll be able to use my handy-dandy router jig to actually set up the recesses specifically to the sizes of those supports. So I can get that in there, set it up, lock it down exactly where it needs to go, and then I can clamp the jig down as well as a little guide or a stop block so that the router can't go any further. So I'm using a pattern cutting bit for the router to get that initial recess in there. So there's a little stop block on either side, and away we go. So I'm going to use that shorter pattern bit initially to make this first pass or first couple of passes, but I eventually will have to use a slightly longer one to get further down into the material. This is basically a 7-minute time lapse sped up so that you could see the full process of doing one of these recesses. Setting up the jig, starting out with a couple passes with the shorter pattern cutting bit, swapping out for the slightly longer one and making the final 2 passes, and then take everything off, and you can see here how it nicely sits in there, at least the depth. It doesn't quite fit in, and that was purposeful. Obviously these are rectangles right now as far as the support pieces, but the router leaves a round recess in there on the ends, and so by simply putting on a round over on each of those corners, it will fit perfectly once I drop them into place, and you'll see the nice satisfying drop in. I didn't want to accidentally glue the gap stop in, since its whole purpose is to move. So I'm putting a little paste wax right around there, because as I now glue in the support pieces, didn't want any of that glue affecting the actual gap stop, because the idea is, again, there's glue on the 2 ends of the support pieces to keep the 2 main parts of the workbench together. This is just simply, I'm putting on a caul so that I can clamp that support piece in. With the glue now dry, it was kind of the moment of truth to see if this concept in my head was actually going to work or not. So propping it up, banging out that center gap stop. Again, I had a lot of friction with those playing cards. That was the idea. So now we get to flip it over. You can see it's nice and solid now with those 2 main pieces held together. And we can stick the gap stop back in, and obviously again there's still a little friction, and it's exactly routed out to that those support pieces. So again, there's a little bit of friction. We're gonna sand down a little bit more on each of those sides. You can see here, except without a little bit of persuasion with a fist, it's a little hard to go down in there. So we're gonna work on that. Just taking a file to kind of round over, put a little bit of a chamfer on the edges of those support pieces, and then a block plane to knock down those sharp corners. This is where things get a little interesting, and again, this was all done kind of in my head, and it was kind of theoretical up to this point. I was hoping it was going to work, but what I'm about to do is make the actual gap stop part. And obviously when it's resting, the gap stop is resting on those support pieces that were routed out earlier. The top is flush with the rest of the workbench. So what I need to do is make a recess for those support pieces to bump up against, for it to rest on. This could have been done with my router jig and handheld router, but I don't know, it's kind of fun to get to use this massive bit and run it through on the router lift. But so you can get a little bit better angle of what's going on. So here in this next step, once I have these 2 different levels, settings where the support pieces will actually go, what I need to do now is connect them, and I'm going to have a slope that's going to allow the gap stop to slide in. And so by taking out this material here, it'll give kind of an inclined plane for, as I push on the gap stop piece itself, it will be able to slide from one stop to the other. So again, I know this is all theoretical. You'll get to see it in action here in a little bit, but I was super thrilled. I just have recently gotten this larger bandsaw with a resaw blade on it, and it made quick work of this 3 or 4 inch white oak. You can see there's some definite cleanup needed. So used my block plane for the majority of this, although that transition at the bottom from the slope to where it was flat, I just could not get that. So busted out the chisels, and really my goal was just to make the transition as smooth as possible without any kind of lip or anything on there. So this was kind of fun to get to pull out some hand tools. right, it's time for the moment of truth. Let's throw that bad boy down in there. Got a nice flat workbench top, and let's see how it slides. There's no wax or anything on here yet, but that was pretty easy to push up, and now I've got a gap stop that I can push a workpiece up against and then back down again, and we're all set. This being cargo flooring, there's quite a few voids and some bug holes and things in this red oak. So some wood filler takes care of all that before I do the final sanding. This is always one of my favorite steps in a project like this, when it's like a panel glue up and you finally get to trim the edge completely flush and make it look finished. But I will go ahead and give the disclaimer. I'm about to put some finish on, and while at a distance this bench looks kind of neat with more of a bare wood, it does look kind of funny with the mixture of white oak and red oak. It's kind of got some pink hues and some more yellow hues, so I wanted to try and even it out by putting on some stain. But I will also make the disclaimer that it's really not my favorite color of stain, which is why I've got a can of it still laying around in my shop and haven't used it on other projects. It's like a hazelnut color, which I really don't love the look of, but my goal here is to protect the workbench. Again, also give it a little bit more of an even color. Again, you can kind of see here the difference between the white and the red oak. So I was hoping that darker stain would kind of make it look more uniform. But it really is not a super pretty finish. And I'm not heartbroken by it because I didn't want my workbench to be so beautiful that I didn't want to use it.